Otto, remembered by history as Otto IV, Holy Roman Emperor, Duke of Saxony by blood, King of Germany by election, and the only man of the Welf dynasty ever to wear the imperial crown, a title he won through a decade of war and lost through a single act of breathtaking betrayal. He was born into a family that had already lost everything. His father, one of the mightiest princes in all of Germany, had been brought low by an emperor's fury before Otto could even walk. Raised far from the land of his birth, he grew up in a foreign court, learning the manners of kings who were not his own. And yet, through the loyalty of uncles, the generosity of popes, and the strange twists of fate that carry some men to greatness, he rose. Higher than anyone in his family had risen in a generation. He was crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He stood at the very summit of medieval power. And then, almost immediately, he broke every promise he had made to get there. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you have just subscribed, welcome to the family. And if you are returning to us once again, welcome back home. It is a genuine pleasure to have you here. Tonight, make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, and let the day gently slip away. Over the next few hours, we will share the calm and complete story of Otto IV, a prince of the House of Welf, who was raised in England, crowned in Rome, excommunicated by the very Pope who had championed him, and ultimately undone on a summer battlefield in northern France. We will softly move through his early years at the English court of his grandfather Henry II, through the long and exhausting civil war he fought for the German crown, through the brief and glittering moment of his imperial coronation, and finally through the slow unraveling that followed, all told slowly and with care to help guide you into sleep. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which part of Otto's remarkable story you found most surprising help, keep these tales coming for all of us. To understand Otto IV, we must begin not with Otto himself, but with his father, because the story of Otto's life is, in so many ways, the story of what his father lost, and what Otto spent his entire existence trying to reclaim, to rebuild, and ultimately to surpass. The world into which Otto was born was a world already shaped by catastrophe. It was a world of fallen power and inherited grievance, of dynastic rivalry so old and so deeply rooted that it had ceased to be merely political and had become something closer to a way of life, a defining condition that no one within it could simply choose to step away from. His father was Henry the Lion, Heinrich der Löwe in German, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, and for a time, the second most powerful man in the whole of the Holy Roman Empire. Henry was a Welf, a member of one of the two great dynastic families that had contested the leadership of Germany for generations. The other family was the Hohenstaufen, and between these two houses, the Welfs and the Hohenstaufens, there ran a rivalry so deep, so bitter, and so enduring that it would shape the politics of Central Europe for over a century. It was a rivalry built not merely on ambition, but on generations of memory, on old slights and older grudges, on the particular kind of hatred that only families can sustain across decades, feeding it with each new disappointment, each new betrayal, each new territorial dispute, until it becomes less a conflict and more a condition of existence. Henry the Lion had, for many years, enjoyed an unusually close relationship with his cousin Frederick, the Holy Roman Emperor known to history as Frederick Barbarossa, Frederick the Red-Beard. One of the towering figures of the medieval world, the two men had grown up together, and in the early years of Frederick's reign, Henry had been one of his most reliable supporters. Frederick, in turn, had rewarded Henry generously, confirming his hold on Saxony, granting him Bavaria as well, and allowing him to build his power into something extraordinary. Under Henry the Lion's rule, great cities rose from the northern German landscape. Lübeck became a thriving trading hub that would eventually give rise to the Hanseatic League. Munich was founded and began to grow into the city it would one day become. Brunswick became the glittering heart of the Welf domain, a city of churches and palaces and the administrative machinery of a great lord's power. At his peak, Henry the Lion controlled a vast, continuous territory stretching from the North Sea coast down through the heart of Germany, a realm within a realm, answerable in theory to the emperor, but in practice almost unto itself. He was a builder, a conqueror, a patron of the arts, and a man of genuine administrative ability. He was also, increasingly, a man who seemed to believe that his power was not merely a grant from the emperor, but something that belonged to him by right, something that could not simply be revoked. But power on that scale breeds enemies, and Henry the Lion, for all his gifts, had a talent for making them. The Saxon nobility chafed under his firm and sometimes arbitrary hand. Other German princes watched his growing dominance with unease, calculating that his continued rise would come at their expense. And Frederick Barbarossa himself, who had once called him cousin and friend, began to see in Henry's swelling power not an asset to the empire, but a challenge to imperial authority. The empire, as Frederick understood it, needed its great lords to be powerful enough to serve imperial purposes and dependent enough not to threaten imperial supremacy. Henry the Lion had tipped past that boundary, and both men knew it. The breaking point came in 1176 on a campaign in northern Italy. Frederick was fighting the cities of the Lombard League, the great alliance of Italian municipalities that had organized to resist imperial domination of their affairs, and he urgently needed Henry's military support. He asked his cousin to bring his forces south and join the campaign. Henry refused. The reasons are still debated by historians across the centuries. Henry may have wanted something Frederick was unwilling to give. The imperial city of Goslar, with its valuable silver mines, had been mentioned as a possible price for Welf military cooperation, and Frederick had refused to cede it. Henry may have calculated that Frederick's campaign would fail regardless of his help, and saw no reason to commit his men to a losing cause. He may simply have believed that the defense of imperial claims in distant Lombardy was not his responsibility, and that his obligations to the emperor did not extend to following Frederick into a war that served Hohenstaufen prestige more than Welf interests. Whatever his reasoning, the refusal was catastrophic in its consequences. Frederick's campaign in Lombardy ended in humiliation, his forces defeated at the Battle of Legnano by the Italian cities. He returned to Germany burning with resentment and with the cold, clear-eyed anger of a man who has been refused when he needed something most, and who has stored that refusal in a part of his memory where it will not fade. He resolved to use the legal and political machinery of the empire against the man who had failed him. The process unfolded over several years, carefully and with the full procedural weight of imperial law behind it. Henry was summoned to answer charges before the imperial court. He failed to appear, whether from defiance or because he believed he could not receive a fair hearing. The sources do not entirely clarify. In 1180, a court of bishops and princes tried him in absentia and found him guilty of insubordination and breach of the imperial peace. Declaring that imperial law overruled the traditional customs and precedents that had always protected German nobles in their lands, the court stripped Henry of both his duchies. Saxony was broken up and redistributed among lesser princes, given in pieces to men who would be loyal to the emperor, rather than to any rival power center. Bavaria was handed to the Wittelsbach family, who would hold it for centuries afterward. The immense Welf domain that Henry had spent decades constructing, those cities, those trade routes, those carefully cultivated networks of lordship and loyalty, was dismantled in a matter of months by the machinery of imperial authority. Frederick then invaded Saxony with an army to enforce the verdict. Henry's former allies, calculating that the emperor's power was now clearly dominant, abandoned him one by one. The great duke who had seemed so invincible found himself alone, without the resources to resist. He finally submitted at a great assembly in Erfurt in November 1181, in what must have been a scene of profound personal humiliation for a man of his pride and his history, throwing himself before the emperor, confessing his defiance, accepting the punishment that imperial justice demanded. He was sentenced to exile from Germany for 3 years. It was into this world of sudden, catastrophic, and very recent loss that Otto came. The year of his birth was approximately 1175, though even this is a matter of scholarly uncertainty and debate. Some sources give 1175, others suggest dates as late as 1182. The exact place of his birth is equally unclear. No contemporary source records it with the kind of precision that would allow us to settle the question cleanly, and later accounts disagree between Brunswick in Germany and Argental in Normandy, where the family spent time during the years of exile. What we know with confidence is that he was the third son of Henry the Lion and his wife Matilda, a woman of considerable standing in her own right. For Matilda was no ordinary duchess. She was the eldest daughter of King Henry II of England and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable royal couples of the medieval world. Through his mother, then, Otto was tied to a second great dynasty, the Plantagenets, the ruling house of England, the family that had built an empire stretching from the borders of Scotland to the foothills of the Pyrenees. Otto, in other words, was not merely a Welf prince born into a fallen family's grievances. He was also a grandson of Henry II of England, a nephew of Richard the Lionheart, and a nephew of the man who would become King John. The blood in his veins connected him to two of the great dynastic networks of 12th century Europe, and it was through those Plantagenet connections, through the English court, through the patronage of English kings, that the first and most formative chapters of his life would be written. When Henry the Lion was sent into exile in November 1181, the family made preparations to leave Germany. They crossed eventually to Normandy and then to England, arriving at the court of Henry II, who received his son-in-law and daughter with the practical generosity of a powerful king who understood the value of family obligations and the political utility of maintaining connections to the Welf cause in Germany. Henry provided the exiled family with lands in Normandy as a residence, with income sufficient to maintain the dignity appropriate to their rank, and with the symbolic protection of the English royal name. For the young Otto, who would have been somewhere between 7 and 10 years old at the time of the family's arrival in England, depending on which birth year one accepts, this transition was the beginning of a new world. England in the 1180s, under Henry II, was a sophisticated and powerful kingdom, perhaps the most administratively developed royal government in Western Europe. Henry II had spent his reign building a centralized system of royal justice and administration that gave the English crown an efficiency and reach that most continental monarchies could only envy. His court was a place of learning, of political discussion, of the arts, and of the constant, restless energy that characterized everything Henry II did. It was an environment where a sharp and curious young mind could absorb a great deal about how power worked, how kings governed, how diplomacy was conducted, and what it meant to be a great lord in the medieval world. Otto grew up in this environment. He learned French, the language of the English court, the language of the Plantagenet world, with the ease of a child who absorbs language from immersion rather than instruction. He already had German from his father's world. He would spend the rest of his life moving between those two linguistic and cultural spaces, and the bilingualism that resulted from this childhood was one of his genuine advantages in the years of political manoeuvring that lay ahead. He became, in the truest sense, a man of two worlds, shaped by England, claimed by Germany, belonging to neither one entirely, and drawing on both as circumstances demanded. The exile years in England were not permanent. In 1185, 3 years after Henry the Lion had submitted and accepted his exile sentence, the term ended and the family was permitted to return to Germany. Henry the Lion had not been restored to his former greatness. The duchies were still gone, the lands still redistributed, but he was allowed to return to his hereditary Welf estates at Brunswick, the ancestral heart of the family's remaining power. His wife Matilda and the children went with him. Otto, at this point still a child, would have returned to Germany too, though whether he remained there or spent further time in England in the years that followed is not entirely clear from the sources. What is clear is that his mother Matilda's death cut the family's English connections in a painfully personal way. She died at Brunswick in June or July of 1189, young and exhausted. She was only 32 or 33 years old, at a moment when her husband was being sent into exile again, this time by the new Emperor Henry VI, Frederick Barbarossa's son, who had inherited his father's hostility toward the Welf family and continued the pressure on the aging duke. Matilda had made the difficult decision to remain at Brunswick to protect her husband's interests while he went into exile rather than accompany him, and she died within months of that decision, before she could see whether it had been the right one. She left behind children who were still young, Otto among them, and a husband who would die 6 years later, in 1195, and who, according to the accounts of his court, had said he wished to sleep beside Matilda both in life and in death. He was buried next to her in Brunswick Cathedral, a testament to a marriage that had, whatever its political origins, become something genuinely affectionate. Henry the Lion's death in 1195 formally ended that generation. The great Welf Duke, who had been both the glory and the catastrophe of the family's recent history, was gone. His eldest surviving son, Henry, became Count Palatine of the Rhine. His younger sons, including Otto, had the Welf name and the Welf connections, but no Grand Duchy, no great territorial base. They were princes of a fallen house, living in the long shadow of their father's ruin, sustained by family loyalty and the memory of former greatness. For Otto, now somewhere in his late teens or early 20s, the question was what to do with that inheritance of glory and loss. And the answer, when it came through England, through the uncle who had become, after his grandfather Henry II's death, the most powerful Plantagenet of the age. Richard I of England became king in 1189, the year both his father Henry II and Otto's mother Matilda died. He was 32 years old, tall and physically imposing, a man of extraordinary military gifts who had spent years in the tournament grounds and on campaign developing the skills of war that would make him, in his own time and long after it, the archetype of the crusading king. He was also, despite the romantic legend that has always surrounded him, a genuinely complex political operator, capable of generosity and of cruelty, of brilliant strategic thinking and of impulsive decision-making, of inspiring loyalty in his followers that was sometimes closer to devotion than mere service. For Otto, Richard's accession was significant in ways that went beyond the personal. Richard was now his uncle and his nearest powerful male relative on the Plantagenet side of the family. He had known Otto since the younger man's childhood. They had overlapped at Henry II's court during the years of the family's exile. And there was, between them, something that went beyond simple political calculation. Richard seems to have genuinely liked his Welf nephew. He invested in Otto's future with a consistency and a generosity that suggests a real personal commitment, not merely dynastic calculation. He became, in effect, the patron and protector that Otto needed in order to have any meaningful future at all. In 1190, as Richard prepared to depart on the Third Crusade, the great expedition to reclaim Jerusalem from Saladin, which Richard had been burning to lead since before he became king, he made a series of arrangements for his realm and his dependents. Among those arrangements was a significant gesture toward his Welf nephew. He granted Otto the earldom of York, one of the major earldoms of northern England, carrying with it substantial revenues and a title that placed the holder among the great lords of the English realm. It was an honour of real substance, and it demonstrated Richard's intention to provide for Otto within the English system of lordship and patronage. There was, however, a complication, and it was a complication that would prove instructive about the nature of power and the gap between titles and realities. The vassals of Yorkshire, the men who actually held lands in the region, and whose cooperation was essential for any earl to exercise real authority over his domain, were deeply and vocally reluctant to accept the authority of a young German prince over their affairs. They questioned the grant, challenged its authenticity, resisted Otto's claims, and effectively prevented him from taking possession of his earldom in any meaningful sense. He may have visited Yorkshire in 1191, and he continued for years afterward to claim the revenues of the earldom as something owed to him. But he never actually received those revenues, never exercised the practical authority of an earl over Yorkshire, and never managed to turn the formal grant into real power on the ground. It was a frustrating and perhaps humiliating experience for a young man of royal blood and genuine ability. To be given a title and then to discover that the people who were supposed to acknowledge it simply refused to do so, to hold a dignity in name without being able to exercise it in practice, was a lesson in the limits of what formal grants of lordship could actually accomplish when the human realities on the ground did not support them. Otto would encounter versions of this lesson repeatedly throughout his career. The gap between formal claims and practical realities would be one of the defining tensions of his political life. Around 1195, Richard began exploring another way to provide for his nephew, one that was considerably more ambitious, and which would, if it had succeeded, have given Otto a position of extraordinary importance. He opened negotiations with King William the Lion of Scotland, with the aim of arranging a marriage between Otto and Margaret, William's daughter. Margaret was, at this time, the heir presumptive to the Scottish throne, which meant that if Otto married her and William died without a male heir, Otto might well become King of Scotland in her right. The scheme, had it worked, would have been remarkable. The Welf prince, who had been raised in the English court of his grandfather, would have become king of a significant northern kingdom, ruling over a realm with its own ancient traditions and its own considerable resources, linked by marriage to the Plantagenet sphere of influence. The negotiations were complicated and prolonged. They involved detailed provisions about where borderlands would be held, about what dowry Margaret would bring, about the relationship between a Welf king of Scotland and his Plantagenet neighbours to the south. They dragged on through several years of diplomatic correspondence and careful hedging on both sides. And then, in August 1198, they became unnecessary in the most decisive possible way. William the Lion's wife gave birth to a son, Alexander, a male heir whose arrival instantly transformed Margaret from a presumptive heir to a secondary figure in the Scottish succession. There was no longer any prospect of Otto becoming King of Scotland through Margaret's inheritance. the negotiations were abandoned. Otto had come closer to a Scottish crown than almost any other German prince of his era, and missed it by the birth of a boy. It was another example of the pattern: opportunities materializing, then dissolving before they could be grasped. Another formal near claim that never became real possession. Having failed to secure Otto either an English earldom he could hold, or a Scottish kingdom through marriage, Richard turned to what he could offer from his own direct resources, without the complications of English vassals or Scottish succession law. In September 1196, he formally invested Otto with the county of Poitou, a substantial territory in western France, part of his Duchy of Aquitaine, and recognized him as Duke of Aquitaine in connection with that grant. It was a more direct and immediate gift than either the York earldom or the Scottish scheme, because it rested on Richard's own ducal authority rather than on the cooperation of third parties. The lands of Poitou were Richard's to give, and he gave them. Otto spent much of the period from September 1196 into mid-1197 in Poitou, administering his new county and learning the practical arts of governance in a real territorial context. The experience was valuable in ways that went beyond mere administrative training. He was governing a significant French territory, dealing with the local lords and clergy and townspeople whose cooperation he needed, managing the revenues of the county and the relationships with the surrounding regions. He was, for the first time, exercising real power, not formal titles resisted by those he was meant to govern, but actual authority over lands that acknowledged him as their lord. He also participated directly in the ongoing military struggle against Philip II of France, the great Capetian king, who was systematically and brilliantly dismantling the Plantagenet continental empire that Henry II and Richard had built. Otto fought alongside Richard in the campaigns in Normandy, gaining direct experience of medieval warfare and of the particular political and diplomatic calculations that surrounded military operations in the complex world of French-English-German relations. He was not merely a ward or a beneficiary. He was a participant, active, engaged, developing the skills that would define his career. Then came the spring of 1199, and the event that changed everything. Richard the Lionheart died. He had been besieging the minor castle of Chalus-Chabrol in the Limousin, a routine military operation that should have carried no special risk, when a crossbow bolt struck him in the shoulder. The wound became infected. The infection spread. Richard, who had survived the hardships of the Crusade and the battles of Normandy and the dungeons of the Austrian Duke, who had held him captive on his way home from the Holy Land, died of a wound taken at an insignificant castle in a routine siege. He was 41 years old, and he died without a legitimate heir. For Otto, the loss was profound and practically significant in ways that went beyond grief. Richard had been his patron, his protector, the man who had consistently worked to provide him with the titles and resources he needed to have a future. Without Richard driving those efforts, the earldom that had never quite materialized, and the Scottish scheme that had dissolved, and the Poitou grant that was his most concrete English connection, all of these things lost the active advocacy of the man who had been their author. Otto was not left without resources or without connections, but he was left without his most powerful champion. The English crown passed to Richard's brother John. John was a complicated man, intelligent in certain ways, capable of genuine administrative ability, but also erratic, suspicious, given to cruelty when he felt threatened, and lacking the personal magnetism that had allowed Richard to inspire the kind of loyalty that sustained a king through difficult times. He was, and would remain, a controversial figure in English memory. But for Otto, John's accession was significant primarily for what it continued, rather than what it changed. John, like Richard before him, had strong reasons to support his Welf nephew in Germany. Family loyalty played a part. Political calculation played an equal part. Supporting Otto against the Hohenstaufens was a useful element of English continental strategy. It kept Germany occupied with its own internal conflicts. It maintained a potential ally in the empire, and it gave England a lever in the complex politics of European power that John was not willing to discard. And by 1119, that support was about to become critically important, because the Holy Roman Empire itself was in the process of tearing itself apart, and Otto was about to find himself at the center of the destruction. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI had died in September 1197, and his death had shaken the foundations of German political life in ways that would not be settled for 17 years. He was only 32 years old, young for an emperor, young for a man who had seemed, during the years of his reign, to be building the Hohenstaufen dynasty into a power of genuinely unprecedented scope. He had conquered the Kingdom of Sicily through his wife's inheritance, bringing the wealthy southern kingdom under imperial rule. He had extracted an enormous ransom for Richard of England, held captive on his return from crusade. He had projected imperial authority across the Mediterranean in ways that his predecessors had only dreamed of. And then he died of a fever, suddenly, and with a child not yet 3 years old, as his heir. The child was Frederick, a Hohenstaufen prince, who would one day become Frederick II, one of the most remarkable and controversial rulers of the entire medieval period. But in 1197, he was simply an infant, far too young to exercise any authority or even to inspire confidence in his future governance. The German princes who were loyal to the Hohenstaufen dynasty looked at the situation and made a practical calculation. They needed an adult king who could actually govern. They turned to Philip of Swabia, Henry VI's younger brother, a man of 30 or so, already experienced in administration and military command as Duke of Swabia, and someone who could be trusted to protect Hohenstaufen interests, while young Frederick grew to an age at which he might be able to take the crown himself. Philip was elected King of Germany at Mühlhausen in Thuringia on 8th March 1198. The election was supported by most of the southern and central German princes, who had the closest ties to the Hohenstaufen network, and who had received promises and payments from Philip in exchange for their backing. It was a solid majority. Philip was, from the perspective of sheer numbers and territorial control, the dominant candidate. But not all of Germany was willing to follow the Hohenstaufen choice without resistance. In the northwest of Germany, in the region around Cologne and along the Lower Rhine, there was a concentration of princes, bishops, and lords who had old reasons to distrust and dislike the Hohenstaufen dynasty, and who saw in the vacuum created by Henry VI's death an opportunity they had not expected to come so soon. The Welf family had roots in the north. The memory of Henry the Lion, whatever his faults, was still honoured there, and the man who had the most to gain from organising these anti-Hohenstaufen forces into a coherent political movement was Archbishop Adolf of Cologne. Adolf was a powerful figure. The Archbishop of Cologne controlled one of the wealthiest and most strategically important dioceses in Germany, and his office carried with it the traditional right to crown the King of Germany at Aachen. This was not a trivial privilege. Aachen was the city of Charlemagne, the ancient capital of the Carolingian Empire, and the traditional coronation site of the German kings. The Archbishop of Cologne's role in that ceremony gave him a constitutional centrality in German politics that went beyond mere wealth or military power. He was the kingmaker by custom, and he was determined to use that role. Adolf and the anti-Hohenstaufen princes decided to elect a Welf candidate as their rival king. The most obvious choice would have been Henry, Otto's elder brother. Older, more experienced, already established as Count Palatine of the Rhine. But Henry was away on the crusade of 1197, absent from Germany at the critical moment when decisions were being made and alliances were being formed. The choice fell instead to his younger brother Otto, who was present, who was available, and who had the crucial endorsement of Richard of England, whose financial resources and diplomatic connections would be essential to any serious challenge to Hohenstaufen power. On 9th June 1198, Otto was elected King of Germany by the anti-Hohenstaufen faction assembled at Cologne. It was not a unanimous election, and it was not an election of the full College of Princes. Philip of Swabia had already been elected 3 months before with a larger supporting coalition, but the Cologne election had its own legitimacy. A significant number of genuine princes had participated, and it had the endorsement of the Archbishop of Cologne, which was constitutionally meaningful. Most significantly, it had Aachen. Otto moved quickly to secure the traditional coronation city, and on 12th of July 1198, Archbishop Adolf of Cologne crowned him King of Germany in the cathedral at Aachen, the ancient church where Charlemagne himself was buried, where German kings had been crowned for generations. The coronation had an enormous symbolic charge, and both sides knew it. Whoever was crowned at Aachen by the Archbishop of Cologne could claim to have fulfilled the proper ceremonial requirements of the German kingship, in a way that Philip's coronation at Mainz, performed by a different archbishop, could not quite match. There was, however, a detail that would not go unremarked by those paying attention. The imperial regalia, the actual crown jewels, the genuine insignia of the German kingship that had been used in previous coronations, were in the hands of the Hohenstaufen party. Philip's supporters had them secured in the south, well away from Cologne or Aachen, so Otto's coronation was performed with substitute regalia, with symbols made for the occasion, rather than the genuine articles that carried the accumulated weight of imperial history. It was a vulnerability, and his enemies would use it in the years ahead to question the authenticity of what had been done at Aachen on that July day. Philip, for his part, was crowned again, a second coronation by another archbishop at Mainz in September 1198, this time with the genuine regalia. He was, in the eyes of his supporters, the true king. Otto was an elected rival, a pretender, a man who had been crowned with fake jewelry by a rebellious faction. In the eyes of Otto's supporters, Otto was the legitimate ruler, properly elected and properly crowned in the proper city by the proper archbishop. Germany now had 2 kings, 2 coronations, 2 sets of princes willing to fight for their respective candidates, and no peaceful way to resolve the contradiction. Civil war was not just possible, it was certain. The conflict that followed was one of the most grinding and exhausting political struggles of the medieval German world. It was not primarily a war of great set-piece battles, though battles did occur, but rather a war of attrition, of shifting alliances, of financial exhaustion, and of the relentless maneuvering of men who calculated and recalculated their positions as the fortunes of the 2 kings rose and fell. German princes, bishops, and lords moved back and forth between the 2 camps with a pragmatism that later historians have found shocking, but that made perfect sense within the political logic of the time. Supporting a king was an investment. You gave him your loyalty and your military resources, and in exchange you hoped to receive confirmations of your lands, grants of new privileges, favourable decisions on disputes with neighbours. When one king seemed likely to win and the other seemed likely to lose, it was rational to be on the winning side. And rationality, in the German Civil War of 1198 to 1214, was a quality that most of the princes displayed with remarkable consistency. In the early years of the conflict, through 1199 to about 1202, Otto had the better of things in the northwest. He held the lower Rhine region. He had the support of the Welf heartlands around Brunswick, and he had the financial and diplomatic backing of England, first Richard's, then John's. Innocent III, the newly elected Pope, was watching the German situation with great interest and with a clear sense of the opportunity it presented. The papacy had, for decades, been locked in tension with the Hohenstaufen emperors over the boundaries between imperial and papal authority in Italy. A Welf emperor who was beholden to the papacy for his recognition seemed, from Rome's perspective, a considerably preferable outcome to a Hohenstaufen continuation. Innocent began manoeuvring to extend his own influence over both sides. In 1201, Innocent formally announced his recognition of Otto as the only legitimate king of Germany. This was a significant intervention. It gave Otto a moral authority that Philip could not easily match, and it threatened Philip's supporters with the spiritual consequences of backing an excommunicated rival. Innocent's recognition came at a price. Otto was required to formalize his promises to the papacy about territorial rights in Italy, about freedom of ecclesiastical elections, about the various practical limitations on imperial power over the church that Innocent was determined to secure. Otto agreed to all of it, apparently with sincerity. At this stage, with his back against the wall in the civil war and the Pope's support potentially decisive, he had every reason to promise whatever was asked. But the civil war did not end simply because the Pope had spoken. Philip continued to fight, continued to win ground, continued to attract the support of princes who found Hohenstaufen, connections more reliable than Welf promises. Through 1202, 1203, and 1204, the momentum shifted. Archbishop Adolf of Cologne, the very man who had organized Otto's election and placed the crown on his head at Aachen, defected to Philip's side in 1204, when the architect of Otto's kingship decided that Philip was now the better bet. It sent a powerful message to everyone else who was still calculating their position. If even Adolf would not stand by Otto, why should lesser lords hold firm? The defections continued. Otto's financial position weakened as England's own resources were strained by John's mounting difficulties in France. More allies went over to Philip. In July 1206, Otto was defeated and wounded in a battle near the town of Wassenberg. Not a catastrophic loss, but a serious one that demonstrated he could no longer rely on battlefield success to maintain his credibility. Even Pope Innocent, who had invested his recognition in Otto's cause, began quietly reconsidering. When a pope reconsidered, princes noticed. The signals from Rome shifted, subtly but unmistakably, toward an acknowledgement that Philip's dominance was becoming a reality that could not simply be wished away by continued insistence on Otto's legitimacy. By early 1208, Otto held little more than his family's hereditary Welf estates around Brunswick. Philip controlled most of Germany and had the recognition of most of the princes. Even Innocent had reached a quiet accommodation with Philip's reality. Otto had fought for 10 years, and he appeared to be losing in a way that was becoming difficult to reverse. His situation was, by almost any objective measure, nearly hopeless. And then, in a single afternoon, everything changed. Philip of Swabia, by the summer of 1208, was approaching what seemed like the final phase of his long rivalry with Otto. He was strong, he was recognized. He had the backing of most of the German princes and the tacit acceptance of the papacy. He was preparing military operations against the last Welf strongholds in the northwest, when he paused his campaign plans to travel to Bamberg, where his niece Beatrice of Burgundy was to be married to Duke Otto of Merania. It was the kind of great dynastic celebration that punctuated the political life of medieval Germany, a gathering attended by princes and bishops and noble lords from across the empire, a festival of music and feasting and the ceremony that expressed in elaborate social form the bonds of lordship and family that held the aristocratic world together. Among those present at Bamberg in June 1208 was Count Otto VIII of Wittelsbach, the Count Palatine of Bavaria. He was a man known to his contemporaries as someone of volatile temperament, a nobleman of significant standing whose emotional instability was a recognized feature of his character, noted even in an age when violent emotion was not exactly unusual among powerful men. And he had a grievance against Philip of Swabia that had been burning in him for years. The grievance was, at its core, about broken promises. Philip had, at various points in the preceding years, made marriage arrangements with Otto of Wittelsbach that were subsequently withdrawn. First, it appears, the hand of one of Philip's own daughters had been discussed and then not followed through. Later, in 1203, Philip had formally betrothed his daughter Kunigunde to the Wittelsbach Count, a gesture made partly to secure his military cooperation against Landgrave Hermann of Thuringia. But as Philip's power grew and stabilized, the Wittelsbach alliance became less necessary, and in 1207, Philip broke off the Kunigunde engagement, instead betrothing her to Wenceslaus, the son of King Otto IV of Bohemia, a politically more advantageous match. Otto VIII of Wittelsbach had been twice promised and twice denied a Hohenstaufen bride. He blamed Philip for both, and he had vowed, in the way that men of his temperament and his era could vow such things, to take revenge. On the 21st June 1208, after the wedding celebrations had concluded and the great lords had retired for the afternoon, Philip went to his private chambers. Otto VIII of Wittelsbach followed him there. What happened in those rooms was swift and irreversible. The Wittelsbach Count, carrying the rage of his two broken promises and whatever particular fury had been building in him through the day, attacked the king. Philip of Swabia was murdered in his private rooms in Bamberg, at a wedding feast, in a scene of personal violence that shattered the festive atmosphere of the day and sent shockwaves across the whole of Germany. Philip was 30 years old. He had been king for 10 years. He had come within reach of complete victory over his Welf rival, and he died not on a battlefield, but in his own rooms at a family celebration, at the hands of a man with a personal grievance. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him and wrote of him afterward, a capable and even admirable ruler, praised by contemporaries, including the poet Walter von der Vogelweide, for his mildness and his generosity. He was the first ruling German king to be assassinated since the era of the Merovingians, centuries before. The immediate reactions were chaotic. Philip's wife, Queen Irene Angelina, who was pregnant, fled in terror when news of the murder reached her. The shock of what had happened contributed to a miscarriage, and she died within weeks. Otto VIII of Wittelsbach escaped from Bamberg in the confusion, going into hiding with loyal followers. He was declared an outlaw, a fugitive from imperial justice, with his lands and offices stripped from him. He managed to evade capture for months, but in March 1209, the imperial marshal Heinrich of Kolden found him hiding in a granary near Regensburg on the Danube. He was caught and beheaded, justice of the swift, physical kind that medieval law applied to those convicted of the murder of a king. For Otto IV, the news of Philip's death must have been almost impossible to absorb at first. He had been on the edge of final, comprehensive defeat. He had been watching his allies drain away, his financial resources dwindle, his political position narrow to the point where serious observers were beginning to treat him as already finished. And then, without any action on his own part, without any strategy he had conceived or executed, his rival was gone. Otto's response to the situation was, by the standards of his career, genuinely impressive. He could have acted with triumph, made demands, pressed advantages, treated Philip's death as a vindication of his own cause, and a judgment against the Hohenstaufen party. He chose instead the more difficult and more politically sophisticated path of reconciliation. He made it publicly and clearly known that he bore no responsibility for the assassination, not merely denying complicity, but actively pursuing the murderer's punishment to demonstrate that he did not benefit from or celebrate political killing. He reached out to Philip's former supporters with offers of accommodation rather than demands for submission. He sought to present himself not as a conqueror over the Hohenstaufen party, but as a ruler who could bring the factions together. And most concretely, most symbolically, he became betrothed to Philip's eldest daughter, Beatrix. She was approximately 10 years old at the time of the betrothal, a child, not a woman. But the political meaning of the engagement was profound. By taking Philip's daughter as his future wife, Otto was declaring his intention to unite the Welf and Hohenstaufen lines, to absorb the Hohenstaufen inheritance into his own, and to make the long civil war not a Welf victory over the Hohenstaufen, but a reconciliation between the two dynastic traditions. It was a wise gesture, and it worked. In November 1208, at a great diet assembled at Frankfurt, Otto was elected King of Germany by all the princes, unanimously, without a rival, without the divisions and faction fights that had characterized every previous stage of the German political drama since 1198. The 10 years of civil war were formally over. At Frankfurt, Otto made a promise that would later acquire a certain irony. He swore that he would not press hereditary claims to the imperial crown on behalf of any future children he might have. This was a concession to the princes' traditional insistence on their right to elect their own king, rather than receiving a hereditary monarchy. It was, at the moment he made it, a reasonable price for their enthusiastic support. He had, after all, no children, and the prospect of children felt distant and contingent. It seemed a small thing to promise. What remained now was the ceremony that would transform a king of Germany into the supreme ruler of Christendom's Western Empire. It was time to go to Rome. The journey to Rome was not merely a physical transit from Germany to Italy. It was a carefully managed political performance, a demonstration of imperial power and papal favor, a declaration to the cities and lords of northern and central Italy that a new emperor was coming, and that he was coming with the Pope's blessing. Every city that received Otto's court, every submission that local lords made as he passed, every ceremony of welcome and recognition was a building block in the edifice of imperial legitimacy that he was constructing piece by piece on his southward march. Before setting out, Otto reaffirmed his promises to Innocent III in exhaustive detail. He would restore to the Papal States all territories that the papacy claimed: the March of Ancona, the Duchy of Spoleto, the former Exarchate of Ravenna, the Pentapolis, lands that the empire had long contested with Rome and that several emperors had tried to hold. He would guarantee freedom of ecclesiastical elections throughout the empire, ending the imperial practice of investing bishops with the symbols of their spiritual office, and thereby exercising control over who filled those positions. He would renounce the imperial claim to revenues from vacant bishoprics, the practice of collecting the income of a diocese during the gap between one bishop's death and another's appointment, which was a significant source of imperial income. He would acknowledge the papacy's suzerainty over the Kingdom of Sicily, where young Frederick was king, and would explicitly forswear any attempt to unite Sicily with the empire under a single rule. These were substantial commitments. They represented, in aggregate, a significant reduction in the practical authority that the Holy Roman Emperor could exercise over the Church and over the Italian territories that had always been a contested zone between imperial and papal power. Otto made them, apparently, with every intention of keeping them, or at least with sufficient apparent sincerity to convince Innocent III that the bargain was real. Innocent, for his part, was willing to take Otto at his word. He had invested too much in the Welf cause to abandon it now without compelling reason, and Otto seemed, on the eve of his imperial coronation, like a man who understood what he owed to the Pope and who was prepared to honour those obligations. Otto travelled south through Italy in the spring and summer of 1209. He received a warm welcome in the great cities of the north. At Milan, the most powerful and prosperous city of northern Italy, he was received with the ceremony appropriate to the coming emperor and invested with the Iron Crown of Lombardy, the ancient crown supposedly containing a nail from the true cross that symbolized the title of King of Italy, a dignity traditionally held by the Holy Roman Emperor before the papal coronation confirmed the full imperial title. The reception in Milan was a significant political demonstration. If even the fierce and independent Milanese were prepared to acknowledge Otto as their king, his Italian legitimacy was solid. He continued south through Verona and Modena and Bologna, receiving submissions and confirmations, dispensing justice and making grants as a king, exercising the authority of a future emperor. The great machinery of medieval ceremonial politics was in full operation, and Otto moved through it with what appears to have been genuine skill and presence. He had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment, learning governance in Poitou, learning diplomacy in the English court, learning the hard lessons of civil war politics in the years of his German struggle. He was, by 1209, a mature and experienced political figure, and the Italian journey gave him the opportunity to demonstrate those qualities in a new theatre. In August 1209, at Viterbo, north of Rome, Otto met Pope Innocent III in person. The meeting was the crucial preliminary to the coronation, the moment at which the emperor-to-be and the Pope who would crown him confirmed the terms of their relationship and satisfied themselves that the promises made in letters and through intermediaries would hold in face-to-face encounter. The conversation at Viterbo was apparently not entirely smooth. Otto was reluctant to concede every specific territorial detail that Innocent was pressing, and there was a degree of negotiation and accommodation on both sides. But a workable agreement was reached. Innocent was satisfied that Otto's commitments were genuine. Otto was satisfied that the coronation would proceed. On 4th of October 1209, in the old Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, the great church that stood at the heart of Latin Christendom, the building above the tomb of the first apostle, the most sacred space in the Western world, Pope Innocent III placed the imperial crown upon the head of Otto of Brunswick. He was, from that moment, Holy Roman Emperor, the secular ruler of Christendom's Western Empire, the successor to Charlemagne and to the long line of emperors who had ruled from Rome in theory and from Germany in practice since the 9th century. He was the first Welf to hold the title. He was the only Welf who would ever hold it. For a man who had been born into a fallen family's exile, who had grown up as a ward in a foreign court, who had seen title after title given and then effectively taken away by the practical realities of power, the moment in St. Peter's must have been extraordinary. The civil war was over. The exile was over. The long, grinding struggle against the Hohenstaufen and their allies was over, resolved not merely by Otto's survival, but by his triumph. He had achieved more than his father had achieved. He had achieved more than anyone in his family had achieved for generations. He was Holy Roman Emperor. And then, almost immediately, he began dismantling everything he had just won. The speed with which Otto abandoned his pre-coronation promises was remarkable. Remarkable even by the flexible standards of political morality that governed medieval European rulers. He had barely been crowned before his forces were moving to consolidate imperial control over the territories he had explicitly, in writing, with witnesses, in the presence of papal legates, promised to leave in the peaceful possession of the Church within months of the October 1209 coronation. Otto's forces occupied the March of Ancona, the Duchy of Spoleto, and the lands that had been bequeathed to the papacy by the Countess Matilda of Tuscany, a great noblewoman of the previous century, whose estates in central Italy had been the subject of prolonged dispute between the empire and the papacy for generations. Otto gave these territories in vassalage to his own allies, transforming them from papal possessions into imperial dependencies. Then he moved further, pressing south toward the Kingdom of Sicily, the specific step that Innocent had told him, explicitly and repeatedly, would be intolerable. Sicily was the line that could not be crossed. The young Frederick of Hohenstaufen was king there, as a vassal of the papacy, and the fundamental strategic concern that had animated papal policy in Germany for years was the prevention of a reunification of the empire and Sicily under a single ruler. If Otto controlled both the Holy Roman Empire to the north and the Kingdom of Sicily to the south, the papacy would be surrounded by imperial territory on all sides, a geopolitical encirclement that would make the Pope a prisoner of the emperor's goodwill rather than an independent sovereign. Innocent had been unambiguous about this. Otto had, before his coronation, specifically agreed to respect Sicily's independence, and now he was marching south to conquer it. Why? The question invites various answers, and none of them is entirely satisfying. One possibility is that Otto, once emperor, found himself governed by the same structural logic that had governed every Holy Roman emperor before him. The empire needed Italian revenues, the empire needed Italian territories, and the papacy's claims over central Italy were, from an imperial perspective, an interference with the natural order of imperial authority that could only be permanently accepted by an emperor who was willing to be less than an emperor. He had spent years positioning himself as the anti-Hohenstaufen candidate, painting himself as the candidate of papal favor and ecclesiastical freedom. But now that he was emperor, the institutional interests of the empire pushed him in exactly the direction that every Hohenstaufen emperor had gone before him. The logic of the imperial office proved stronger than the promises of the man who held it. Another, less charitable explanation is that Otto's promises had always been primarily tactical. The price of a crown he intended, once he had it, to wear on his own terms. Medieval rulers who made large commitments to secure large prizes were not always men who expected to honor those commitments in full once the prize was won. The logic of acquisition differed from the logic of stewardship. Otto had needed the Pope to get the crown. Once he had the crown, he no longer needed the Pope to the same degree, and the promises that had been necessary to secure Innocent's endorsement felt, perhaps, like constraints that belonged to the period before power, rather than obligations that should govern its exercise. Whatever his reasoning, the consequences were clear and swift. Innocent III was furious. He sent warnings and demands to Otto, laying out the specific violations of specific promises and demanding that Otto comply with his pre-coronation agreements. Otto ignored them. Innocent sent more urgent, more explicit communications, invoking the spiritual authority of the papacy and the potential consequences of continued defiance. Otto continued his campaign, pushing further south into Apulia and approaching Sicily. On 18th November 1210, Pope Innocent III excommunicated Otto IV, Holy Roman Emperor, removing him from the sacramental community of the Church, releasing his subjects from their oaths of loyalty to him, and formally declaring him an enemy of God and of the Apostolic See. The excommunication was a devastating political weapon, not merely a spiritual penalty. In the medieval world, where the Church's authority over the eternal fate of souls gave it a power over behavior that no secular government could match, excommunication meant that every lord who continued to follow Otto was, In the eyes of canonical law, sinning by doing so, it gave his enemies, and he was rapidly acquiring enemies, theological justification for abandoning him. It invited revolt, organized under the banner of righteousness. An innocent did not stop at excommunication. He used the Diet of Nuremberg in September 1211 to actively organize the German princes against Otto, encouraging them to renounce their allegiance to the excommunicated emperor and to turn instead to Frederick, the young Hohenstaufen, who had been waiting in Sicily, who had been educated in that sophisticated southern kingdom, and who was now, at 16 or 17 years old, being brought forward by the papacy as the answer to the Otto problem. Frederick, who would one day be called Stupa Mundi, the wonder of the world, had been a pawn of papal politics since his infancy. Now he was being transformed into a player. Otto returned to Germany from his Italian campaign in March 1212, and for a time he made real progress in reasserting his authority over the German princes who had been wavering. He still had supporters, the nobles of the Lower Rhine, the old Welf heartlands in the northwest, the men whose regional interests and family connections made them reliable Welf partisans regardless of how the broader political winds were blowing. And he still had money from his uncle John of England, who continued to channel financial support toward his nephew as part of his broader anti-French strategy on the continent. But then came August 1212, and the death of Beatrix of Hohenstaufen, Philip's daughter, the girl he had betrothed to himself after Philip's murder, as the central symbolic gesture of Welf Hohenstaufen, reconciliation, died. She had been, in the years since the betrothal of 1208, the living symbol of the peace that Otto had promised to build between the two great rival dynasties. Her betrothal had brought Philip's former supporters into Otto's camp. Her blood was Hohenstaufen blood, and as long as she was Otto's future wife, former Hohenstaufen partisans could tell themselves that they were not betraying their old allegiance, but joining a new synthesis. When she died, that symbolic bridge collapsed. There was no longer any personal bond holding the Hohenstaufen party to Otto, and Frederick, young, brilliant Hohenstaufen by blood, backed by both Rome and France, was now the obvious alternative. In December 1212, Frederick II was elected King of Germany by most of the German princes. He was 18 years old, and he had arrived in Germany from Sicily in the autumn of 1212, gathering supporters as he came, demonstrating a personal charisma and political intelligence that impressed even those who had not expected much from a young man who had spent his formative years in the south. Otto still held power in parts of Germany, still had his supporters, still claimed the imperial title, but the ground was shifting rapidly and irreversibly. The excommunicated emperor was watching the empire drain away from him, and the final blow was still to come. The coalition that formed against France in 1213 and 1214 was, in its conception, a serious and potentially decisive attempt to resolve the great Anglo-French confrontation that had defined the preceding decade of European politics. Otto and his uncle King John of England had each in their own spheres suffered major reverses at the hands of Philip II Augustus of France. John had lost Normandy and most of the Angevin continental empire that his father and brother had built. Otto had been weakened by his Italian adventures and by the defection of German princes to Frederick II, and he needed a decisive military success to reverse the momentum of his decline. They were natural allies, united by common enemies and complementary resources. John had money and the alliance of the English and Poitevin lords. Otto had the military manpower of the Northern German and Flemish coalition, including the support of Count Ferrand of Flanders and Count Renaud of Boulogne, two powerful French vassals who had their own reasons to resist the expanding power of the Capetian monarchy. The strategy they developed was, in its broad outline, elegant. John would land an army in western France, in the ancestral Plantagenet territories of Aquitaine and Anjou, stirring up revolt among the local lords who had always been ambivalent about Capetian authority, and pressing north and east toward Paris from the south and west. Simultaneously, Otto with the Northern Coalition, the forces of Flanders, of Boulogne, of the Lower Rhine region, would advance from the north through Flanders, also pressing toward Paris. Philip Augustus, caught between these two converging forces, would be unable to concentrate his full strength against either. His armies would have to divide. Divided, they would be vulnerable. The coalition would prevail on at least one front, and the strategic situation in France would be transformed. The plan required both prongs to perform. It failed because they did not. John landed in France and initially made progress in the south, but in early July 1214, he was checked and sharply defeated at La Roche-aux-Moines, near Angers, and withdrew without pressing further. The southern prong of the campaign collapsed before it could fulfill its role of tying down Philip's southern forces and drawing his attention away from the north. Philip, freed from the southern threat, was able to turn his full strategic attention northward, marching with his main army to confront the coalition forces that Otto commanded in Flanders. The two forces came together on 27th of July 1214, near the village of Bouvines in Flanders, a Sunday, which contemporary accounts noted with a kind of moral weight, since Sunday was traditionally a day of peace, on which Christian men were not supposed to fight. The setting was a marshy plain, near a narrow bridge over the river Marque, east of Lille. Philip's forces had been moving westward when scouts brought word that the coalition was advancing to intercept them. He turned his army around to face the enemy, a decision made in haste, with limited room to maneuver because of the bridge and the marshy ground on either side of it. Philip's military council, led by the Hospitaller knight Guérin, organized the French forces for battle with skill and speed. The French army was somewhat smaller than the coalition, though medieval chroniclers exaggerated both sides' numbers to the point where modern historians cannot agree on exact figures, but it was well led and fighting on ground of its choosing, which partly compensated for the numerical difference. The battle was fierce, confused, and lasted several hours in the July heat. Contemporary chroniclers, writing afterward from notes and memory, and with the inevitable bias of men who served the winning side, give us a picture of extraordinary individual drama amid the general chaos of medieval mass combat. On the French right wing, the cavalry fighting broke in France's favour early. On the left wing, the French also prevailed, and William Longsword, the Earl of Salisbury, was taken prisoner, a significant capture that deprived the coalition of one of its senior commanders and signalled that things were not going well. In the centre, the fighting was hardest, and the outcome least clear for the longest time. The coalition forces, including powerful infantry from the Low Countries who were experienced and determined fighters, drove forward against the French line with real force. And then came the moment that every subsequent account of Bouvines remembered above all others. Philip Augustus himself, fighting in the centre of his own line, was pulled from his horse by a group of Otto's German foot soldiers. He was unhorsed and surrounded, briefly in genuine danger of being killed or captured. The French knights fought furiously to protect their king, cutting down the German soldiers who had seized him. Philip, somehow uninjured, remounted his horse and continued fighting. It was a moment of extraordinary personal danger for the French king, and the accounts of it, written in the decades after the battle, transformed it into something almost miraculous. Philip, protected by God's grace, escaping death through faith and the loyalty of his men. Otto, commanding from the centre, came under sustained pressure as the battle's momentum shifted toward the French. The coalition lines on both wings had been broken. The centre, where he was fighting, was increasingly isolated. He recognized that the battle was lost. He attempted to withdraw. His horse was killed beneath him. He found another mount. He fought his way clear of the immediate press of battle and rode hard from the field, escaping the pursuit that the French cavalry launched as the coalition broke. He reached Cologne and took refuge there, exhausted, defeated, and stripped of the last military credibility that had sustained his claim to imperial power. The Battle of Bouvines lasted a few hours on a Sunday afternoon in July. Its consequences lasted for generations. For Philip Augustus, it was the confirmation of everything his long, patient, brilliant reign had been building toward: the absolute supremacy of the Capetian monarchy over its French vassals and over the Angevin inheritance that had threatened French royal power since the days of Henry II. For King John, it was the catastrophe that broke the last credibility of his reign, accelerating the baronial revolt that would force him, less than a year later, to seal Magna Carta on the meadow at Runnymede. For Frederick II, it cleared the path to the imperial throne that he would hold for the rest of his remarkable life. And for Otto IV, for the Welf prince who had fought and sacrificed and climbed to the top of the medieval world, it was the end. He could not recover from Bouvines. His remaining supporters in Germany abandoned him, one by one, and then in groups, moving to Frederick as quickly as they could. The formal deposition came in 1215, when the German princes stripped him of the royal title and recognized Frederick II as their king. Frederick was crowned at Aachen that same year, the same city where Otto had been crowned 17 years before, the same ancient Carolingian church, but a different dynasty and a different era. After Bouvines, after Cologne, after the formal deposition of 1215, Otto retreated to the one place that had always been the foundation of his family's identity and his family's persistence through every disaster: Brunswick. It was the city his father had built up, the city where his parents were buried, the ancestral heart of the Welf domain that had survived the catastrophe of 1180 and the long years of exile and the grinding civil war and the catastrophic fall from imperial power. It was the place where Welfs went when the wider world had rejected them, and it was where Otto went now. He was still technically the excommunicated Holy Roman Emperor. The excommunication pronounced by Innocent III in 1210 had never been formally lifted during the years of his decline, though its political force had long since ceased to matter in practical terms. In his final years, however, Otto made peace with this. He confessed his sins. He submitted himself to the Church's processes of reconciliation. He was absolved from the ban by a Cistercian monk, the sentence of excommunication formally lifted, his standing as a Christian in good standing formally restored. He died reconciled to the Church, which was not nothing for a man of his era and his faith. His second wife, Maria of Brabant, was with him in his final years. They had married in May 1214, just months before the disaster of Bouvines. A marriage made in haste, perhaps, in the complicated political circumstances of that period, when Otto was still technically emperor and still fighting to maintain his position against Frederick's challenge. Maria was the daughter of Henry III, Duke of Brabant, and she was by all accounts a person of genuine dignity and intelligence. She survived Otto by many decades, dying only in 1260, and the statues of the two of them that can still be seen in Brunswick, carved in stone long after Otto's death, show a couple of apparent equality and grace, a memorialization of the marriage that was also a memorialization of the last of the Welf emperors. But the marriage was childless, like his first marriage to the young Beatrix, who had died before the marriage was ever properly solemnized, before it had a chance to produce the heirs that might have given Otto's dynasty a future. The marriage to Maria produced no surviving children. The Welf line would continue through Otto's brothers and their descendants, through his brother Henry, who had become Count Palatine of the Rhine, and through the further branches of the family. The Welf inheritance would pass forward into the medieval and early modern world. But the direct imperial line, the line from which the first and only Welf Holy Roman Emperor had come, ended with Otto. He had no sons. He had no daughters. He left no dynasty behind him. In the final years, 1216, 1217, and into the early months of 1218, there were occasional gestures toward political recovery. Some sources suggest that Otto made efforts in 1217 and 1218 to reassert himself in German affairs, to find some path back to relevance or even to restored power. None of these efforts produced results. The political world of the empire had moved on. Frederick II was emperor in everything but Otto's memory, supported by the papacy, supported by France, supported by most of the German princes. The Welf moment, the brief and brilliant and ultimately self-destructive moment when a son of Henry the Lion had held the imperial crown, was over. The Danish conquest of Hamburg in these years, a blow to Welf power in the north, was another reminder of how much had changed. And the death of John of England in October 1216 removed the last of Otto's great Plantagenet uncles, the last direct connection to the English royal court that had raised him. John had been, for all his faults, a consistent supporter of his Welf nephew. With John gone, the ties that bound Otto to England, ties of blood and memory and shared interest that went back to his childhood in Henry II's court, were reduced to history. Otto died on 19 May 1218 at Harzburg Castle in Lower Saxony. He was somewhere between 42 and 43 years old, depending on which birth year one accepts. The accounts of his final hours are varying and sometimes contradictory. Medieval death scenes were important moments for the articulation of moral lessons, and chroniclers had their own purposes in describing them. What seems clear is that he died having made his peace with the Church, having been absolved of his excommunication, and having faced the end with a penitential spirit, appropriate to a man who had lived with the knowledge, for years, that he had broken promises of enormous consequence and that the world had suffered for it. His body was carried to Brunswick Cathedral and interred there, in the same church where his father Henry the Lion and his mother Matilda of England had already been laid to rest. 3 generations of the House of Welf, brought together in the city that had been the centre of their identity through exile and humiliation, and the brief, brilliant moment of imperial triumph. The cathedral that Henry the Lion had built as a monument to Welf power and Welf piety became, in the end, the resting place of the man who had taken that family's ambition to its farthest limit, and of the parents who had made him possible. History has not been entirely certain what to make of Otto IV, and perhaps that uncertainty is itself an appropriate response to a life of such dramatic contrasts. He stands in the historical record between 2 figures of overwhelming vividness. On one side, the legendary Richard the Lionheart, the crusading king whose reputation has coloured 8 centuries of storytelling about the age of chivalry. On the other side, the astonishing Frederick II, the Stupor Mundi, who would spend the next 4 decades as emperor rewriting the relationship between the empire, the papacy, and the intellectual culture of Europe. Between these 2 colossi, Otto can seem like an interval, a man who occupied an important moment without quite rising to it. But to leave it there would be to do Otto a significant injustice, and to miss what is genuinely instructive about his story. Consider where he began. He was born into a family that had been publicly humiliated, stripped of its territories, and driven into exile before he could walk. His father was a man whose historical identity was shaped, in the end, by a catastrophic and very public fall from power. A man remembered as much for what he lost as for what he had built. His mother died young, at 32 or 33, in the middle of another exile, before she could see whether her marriage had ultimately been worth the upheaval. Otto grew up as a ward in a foreign court, without the natural base of power and patronage that most princes of his generation could take as their birthright. He was passed over for earldoms that refused to accept him. He nearly became King of Scotland and missed it by a birth. He was given Poitou and then the wars that came with it. He entered the German political world with a Welf name, a name that meant something in the northwest, but that also meant, in large parts of Germany, the name of the man who had been defeated and humiliated by Frederick Barbarossa. From this beginning, he climbed, through persistence, through diplomatic skill, through the ability to inspire real loyalty in the men who mattered. Richard the Lionheart, John of England, Pope Innocent III, Archbishop Adolf of Cologne in the early years, the princes of the Lower Rhine throughout. He fought his way through a 10-year civil war that nearly destroyed him on multiple occasions. He survived defeats, betrayals, the defection of crucial supporters, financial crises, military setbacks. He kept fighting when many men would have made peace with defeat. And on 4th of October 1209, in the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. That is not a small thing. That is, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary thing. A son of the disgraced house of Henry the Lion, raised in exile in a foreign court, had become the supreme secular ruler of the Western Christian world. Whatever happened after, that moment had happened. What happened after is also part of the story, and it is where the instructive sadness of Otto's career becomes clearest. He had the crown for barely a year before he began destroying the alliances that had given it to him. He broke his promises to the papacy with a speed that suggests either extraordinary arrogance or a fundamental failure to understand how dependent he still was on the goodwill he was discarding. He pushed into Sicily when every piece of strategic and moral wisdom available to him told him not to. He invited the excommunication that transformed his political situation from difficult to nearly impossible. He allowed the death of Beatrix, an event outside his control, to shatter the Hohenstaufen reconciliation he had carefully constructed without finding a way to rebuild it. The qualities that had served him so well in the long struggle upward, the stubbornness that had kept him fighting when reason might have counseled peace, the refusal to be constrained by the expectations of others, the willingness to push beyond what had been promised or agreed, turned, once he had the power he had sought, into the very qualities that destroyed him. Stubbornness became faithlessness. Independence became betrayal. The refusal to be constrained by others' expectations became a refusal to honor his own solemn commitments. It is a pattern that repeats itself in the lives of powerful individuals across many times and many cultures. The virtues that create assent and the virtues that sustain governance are not always the same virtues. The qualities that allow a man to fight his way to the top of a competitive and dangerous world are not always the qualities that allow him to govern wisely once he arrives there. Otto is an unusually clear example of this dynamic. His story makes the pattern visible in a way that makes it easy to recognize and difficult to dismiss. His reign, despite its brevity and its failure, left genuine traces in the world. The promises he made to Innocent III, even the promises he broke, established in formal documents a framework for papal-imperial relations that influenced the politics of the papacy and the empire for decades after his death. The Concordat of Neuss, in which he had ratified the independence of the Papal States and defined their boundaries, was ironically one of the most significant early documents confirming the practical authority of the papacy in central Italy. He built the legal architecture of the thing he was trying to destroy. The Battle of Bouvines, to which his failed coalition strategy contributed, reshaped Western Europe in ways that were not apparent in the immediate aftermath. Philip Augustus's triumph confirmed the Capetian monarchy's supremacy and accelerated the consolidation of the French state that would, in the following centuries, make France the dominant power in European affairs. John's defeat at Bouvines and the baronial revolt that followed led directly to Magna Carta, one of the foundational documents of English constitutional history, born partly from the failure of the military adventure that Otto and John had organized together. Frederick II's confirmation on the imperial throne opened 4 decades of one of the most extraordinary reigns in the history of the Holy Roman Empire, a reign shaped in its earliest phases by the process of replacing Otto. Even in defeat, Otto's career had consequences, and as for the House of Welf, the dynasty of which he was the sole imperial representative, it endured. The family continued to produce significant rulers in the territories it held through the medieval and early modern periods. The Duchy of Brunswick, the Welf heartland, where Otto had been raised and where he died, passed through generations of Welf rulers, growing and changing and eventually transforming into the Electorate of Hanover in the 17th century. And in 1714, when Queen Anne of Great Britain died without an heir, and the succession passed to the nearest Protestant relative, it was a Welf who became king. George III, the first of the Hanoverian dynasty that would rule Britain for over a century, was a descendant of the same House of Welf that had produced Henry the Lion and Matilda of England, and eventually their third son, Otto. The dynasty that had produced the only Welf Holy Roman Emperor also produced, through paths that wound through centuries of German history, the kings of the country where Otto had grown up. There is something quietly remarkable about that. Otto never belonged entirely to England and never belonged entirely to Germany. He was a man between worlds, shaped by the English court of his grandfather and the German politics of his family's ambitions. Neither one thing nor the other, and in some ways both at once, that the family he represented should eventually find its longest-lasting institutional home in the country that had raised him seems, from the distance of 8 centuries, like a very long resolution to a tension that began with a child crossing the Channel to his grandfather's court in the early 1180s. And so ends the story of Otto IV, the English-raised Welf who climbed from a family's ruin to the greatest throne in medieval Christendom, and who held it, briefly and brilliantly and disastrously, before history moved on and left him to the quiet of his Brunswick estates and his family's cathedral. He was a man of his age, ambitious, resourceful, shaped by forces beyond his control, undone in the end by the very qualities that had lifted him. He fought for what he believed was his by right of blood and election and war, and for one extraordinary morning in Rome in October 1209, he stood in the Basilica of St. Peter, with the imperial crown on his head and the acknowledgement of the Western world that he was its foremost secular ruler. That the moment did not last is part of the story too. All crowns are temporary. All power passes. The great arguments that fill the chronicles of the medieval world, between Pope and Emperor, between Welf and Hohenstaufen, between the claims of blood and the claims of election, were resolved not by the strength of any individual, but by the slow, impersonal pressure of time and circumstance, and the endlessly renewable capacity of dynastic rivalry to consume the men who carry it forward. Otto rests now at Brunswick Cathedral, beside the father whose fall shaped his world, and the mother whose Plantagenet blood gave him his English connections and his particular place in the fabric of medieval European history. He is not the most famous of the Holy Roman Emperors. He is not the most celebrated of the medieval kings. He does not have the romantic legend of his uncle Richard, or the intellectual brilliance of the Frederick who replaced him. But he is, in his way, one of the most human of them. A man who wanted everything, who climbed to everything, and who, through a failure of fidelity to his own promises, lost the everything he had worked so long and so hard to gain. We hope his story has brought you peace tonight. We hope the slow passage of these old events, the courts and the campaigns, the coronations and the betrayals, the long retreat to Brunswick, and the quiet of the final years at Harzburg, has helped the day grow distant, and that the world outside feels a little further away than it did when we began. This is Sleepy Crown Reborn, and we will be here again when you are ready. Sleep well.